I'm sick of your wasteful spending. Seriously, what a terrible wife you are. Just dump her already. My name is Yolanda. I'm 31. My husband, Keith, is 3 years younger than me, at 28. I work part-time 3 days a week at a local coffee shop. Keith's family home is a 15-minute walk away. On the other hand, my family home is a plane ride away. Keith's brother Richard lives with his parents in the family home. Keith's mother, Yasmin, seems to adore Richard and hardly pays any attention to us. As a wife, I'm thankful for that distance. But Keith, being the younger son, seems to have a complex about not being the favored child like Richard is. I'm not as expected as Richard, Keith once told me out of the blue. Richard appears more accomplished compared to Keith, but I love Keith's earnest and honest nature. Despite his occasional anxiousness, one night a call came from Keith's family's home to his mobile phone. The details were unclear, but apparently Richard had suddenly left the house. I was surprised, since I always thought Richard and his parents got along well. I asked Keith about it, but he didn't reveal anything. Days passed without clarity, and then Keith said, "We should save more, considering a home of our own and future kids." Until now, I had been using more than half of my part-time salary of $700 as discretionary money. I'm not one for frivolous spending. But indeed, at this rate, a house was a distant future. After discussion, meticulous Keith, better with numbers, took over the finances. The part-time income went entirely to savings. Keith would give me a monthly allowance for personal use. However, I was dissatisfied with the amount. Keith suggested I manage with just $10 a month. Naturally, I objected to this elementary school level allowance. But I reluctantly agreed after Keith said, "I'll work on increasing my income. So let's set a goal and work towards it together." As expected, it was tough. Spending even $1 made me anxious. But I kept reminding myself for our future home, for when we have kids. After 3 months of this lifestyle, Keith's behavior began to change. He scolded me for wasteful spending whenever he saw a coffee cup in the trash. It was just a $2 coffee from the convenience store. A little luxury after days of restraint. When I bought ready-made meals, he'd say, "You wouldn't need this if you cooked properly." Around the same time, Keith's parents began visiting on weekends. Yasmin's change in attitude from being glued to Richard to frequent visits felt odd, even repulsive, but Keith seemed happy. Every weekend, Yasmin would make snide remarks. "Aren't you capable of decent hospitality when your husband's mom visits? Useless." Or, "Still no grandchildren? Living off Keith's earnings and not contributing anything?" Whenever children were mentioned, Keith's father, Yancey, would say inappropriately, "Having trouble? Should I give it a try?" with a leering smile. Yasmin would then glare at me as if annoyed. Sometimes she would even throw away my cooking, claiming, "Such poor food doesn't suit my taste." Keith did nothing but lightly laugh, even in the face of her harsh words. I was shrinking under the constant verbal abuse and Keith's intimidating gaze. I can't do anything if I leave here without financial means. If I just endure, I can keep this life. That's what I had come to believe. I was numbing myself. Then one day, an invitation for lunch came from Renee, a colleague from my office days. She was my closest friend, and I was happy to hear from her. Timidly, I told Keith I wanted to go, but he dismissed it outright. I'm not wasting money on such frivolity. Living such an easy life and doing as you please. I'm staying at my parents' tonight. Think about what you've done. He left after saying that. I stood there, listless, when Renee called me again. It's been a while. Are you okay? Busy? I hadn't heard Renee's voice in such a long time. It was cheerful. The moment I heard it, tears overflowed in my eyes, which I thought had become numb. What's wrong? What happened? Renee seemed surprised to hear me crying, but I couldn't speak. I could only cry. Anyway, let's meet up tomorrow, okay? Definitely. Yeah, I managed to reply and hung up the phone. It had been a long time since I went out, other than my part-time job and shopping. It's been so long. Renee looked as vibrant and beautiful as ever. Suddenly, I felt shabby in comparison. What happened? Are you okay? Renee asked, looking surprised to see me. Catching my reflection in the glass, I saw myself in wrinkled clothes, thin and aged. Without answering, Renee suggested we go to a family restaurant, saying it was just for the time being. What will you have? Renee opened the menu, but I only ordered from the drink bar. However, meals for two were brought to our table. Renee put a knife and fork in front of me. Eat first. We'll talk after. The meal felt warmer than what I ate at home, and I almost cried. So, what happened? Well, I told Renee everything that had happened. Renee was speechless. After a moment of silence, she took out several $100 bills from her wallet and pressed them into my hand. What? Wait. Confused, I heard Renee repeatedly say, listen, buy a digital voice recorder with this money. Then call your parents and tell them honestly about the situation. Got it? You can do it, right? Also, have you checked the paper statements? Do you know how much is saved? I shook my head, and Renee sighed deeply before speaking firmly. Get a grip. You're not at fault here. Renee held my hands. But I can't accept this. When I protested, Renee smiled. I'm not giving this to you. It's just a loan. When you get yourself back on track, you'll pay me back. Her words woke me up. Thank you. I squeezed her hand in return. What are we two women doing here? I laughed for the first time in a long while at Renee's words. With a newfound clarity from Renee's words, I bought a digital recorder. When I got home, I immediately pulled out the paper statements from the drawer where I kept valuables. Looking at them, I nearly fainted. For several months, tens of thousands of dollars had been withdrawn, leaving a meager balance. What is this? I was on the verge of panic, but tried to keep my sanity. Then the front door opened. Even though it was before sunset, Keith returned home with Yasmin. I quickly pocketed the paper statement and headed to the living room. Before I could greet them, Keith, seeing my unusual attire, yelled, "Where have you been?" Startled by his gaze, I quietly pressed the switch on the digital voice recorder in my pocket. I went to a family restaurant with Renee, a friend I haven't seen in a while. Keith, infuriated by my reply, slammed his bag on the floor. A family restaurant? Don't mess around. Don't waste the money I earn, he yelled even louder. Behind him, Yasmin sneered. Your wife is a terrible spendthrift, isn't she? Looking calmly at Keith and Yasmin, I held on to the paper statement. What's this about? How do you spend so much money in such a short period of time? Keith faltered for a moment, then brazenly began to speak, satisfied. He had been spending on Yasmin's luxury brands, Yancey's car, and their trips. The Keith in front of me seemed like a stranger. The Keith I loved was nowhere to be found. What? All of this for Yancey and Yasmin? Was the talk about saving for our home, for our kids, all a lie? Anger welled up inside of me. The miserable and humiliating feelings of the past months resurfaced, and I glared at Keith. What's with that look? I'm not in the wrong. I'm the one feeding you with my money. So don't you dare speak up. He yelled and slapped me across the face. I stumbled, hitting my elbow on the corner of the table. Watching me, Yasmin sneered. That's right. Complaining about my precious son? A worthless wife who's nothing but a burden. Keith, you should get rid of such a wife. Holding my cheek, I slowly stood up and said, understood, then left the house. I stayed in a business hotel with the remainder of the money I borrowed from Renee and called my parents. They were shocked to hear my story and promised to come right away. I called Renee to thank her and to let her know I would confront Keith and his parents tomorrow. The next day, my parents arrived on the first morning flight. Seeing my swollen face, Mom burst into tears. Dad was furious after hearing the story. I felt somewhat guilty. We then visited the hotel and the courthouse before heading to Keith's family home. Keith and his parents were waiting for us there. What do you mean by staying out overnight? I won't forgive you even if you apologize, Keith yelled, his first words laced with anger and a sneer. Dad silenced Mom, who was about to say something, and we sat opposite Keith's family. What kind of upbringing did you give your daughter? Keith, flanked by his parents, said imposingly. That's right. Isn't it absurd for a housewife to stay out overnight, leaving her husband? Yasmin interjected. My parents looked straight at Keith's parents. Then Dad said, We've heard from our daughter. Could you please enlighten us about the money flow? Their faces showed dismay at Dad's calm but forceful question. But they quickly responded, So, we're doing a falal duty. What's wrong with that? A wife should understand, right? Still, unapologetically, defending their actions. Using money lied about a family on wasteful expenses is considered falal piety in your family? Mom said, emotional. Keith retorted with disdain. I'm making my parents happy, and that's for the family. After all, you're living off the money I earn. I even give you spending money. But Mom countered, holding back tears. You took all her salary and gave her $10. Don't you feel anything? So, Yasmin cut off Keith's reply. She married into our family. She should just obey. Housewives don't need spending money, complaining about her own faults and blaming others. How dare she bring her parents to complain? It's a privilege to receive anything from my son. With the eldest son gone, Keith is all we have left. Right, Dad? That's right. We don't need a stupid son like that, Yancy said, arms crossed. Keith, pleased with his parents' words, sneered. Exactly. I'm the head of this household. Forget that traitor Richard. I'll protect Mom and Dad. That's when I realized why Keith had changed so suddenly. The affection from his parents, once solely for Richard, was now his due to Richard leaving. He was trying to regain the emotional nourishment he missed as a child. So he spent money as his parents dictated. He had become a child, not an adult building a home. I can't do this anymore. I've reached my limit, I said quietly amidst their arguing. After a moment of silence, Keith scoffed. What do you mean, can't? You want a divorce? Yes. I am not a slave to be exploited by you, nor a tool to appease your parents, I said calmly and presented the filled-out divorce papers on the table. Yasmin burst into laughter. We don't mind. We were saying we should return such an impudent older wife. Come on out, dear. She looked towards the back. A young woman with a large belly appeared. Keith's new wife. She's only 20, but a fine girl. She'll bear a proper heir, just as we wish. The young woman, with brown hair, showing black roots, and wearing fluorescent clothes, still with a touch of childishness, looked at me condescendingly, laughing just like Yasmin. Dad, who all along reached his breaking point. He was about to slam the table and stand up. I stopped him and said calmly, So you were having an affair, is that correct? Keith choked on his words at this, but I looked him in the eye and said, Understood. Then Yasmin said, I'll pay the compensation in the divorce trial, though, given your own faults, don't expect a large sum. Still as assertive as ever. Yancy and Keith had faces that screamed machismo. Like Dad, fists clenched and eyes bloodshot with anger. Mom was trying to contain her fury. I nodded to her strongly and told the in-laws, Actually, I've invited a guest myself, and pulled out my mobile phone. The one who appeared shortly after was Richard. Richard! Yasmin exclaimed in a strange voice. What are you doing here now, Richard? As Keith tried to stand, Yasmin leapt at Richard with such force. Her face was a picture of astonishment. You're back? Overjoyed, Yasmin grabbed Richard's hand, and he shook it off and said in a low voice, Mom, I've heard everything. Heard? What do you mean? Who told you? Behind Richard was a slender, beautiful woman, and further back, Renee. Renee and I exchanged glances. Richard, who are these people? They're my fiancée, Rebecca, and my friend, Renee. Fiancé? Richard, you're getting married? Mom didn't know. Yasmin, flustered, looked back and forth between Richard and his fiancée. Richard then came forward, sighed deeply, and bowed to me and my parents. I'm sorry for the trouble my brother and parents have caused, he said, bowing deeply. What? Why are you apologizing, Richard? Hey, you! What did you say to my son? As Yasmin lunged at me, I said, I've been on a call the whole time, letting Richard and the others listen outside, and showed the screen of my mobile phone. Yasmin glared at me with a terrifying look and tried to snatch the phone. But Richard shouted, Enough! And forcefully made her sit down. I'm sick of Mom's meddling and Dad's outdated favoritism towards the eldest son, ignoring the younger. I'd break if I'd stay here. As Richard overpowered the scene, the in-laws tried to speak, but Richard continued. I'm going to marry Rebecca and become part of the family. At Richard's words, Yasmin started causing a scene again. Become part of the family? How could you decide that on your own? While pulling away, Yasmin, who clung to Richard, Keith said soothingly, Mom, I'm here, aren't I? Who cares about Richard? But Yasmin shouted, You shut up, and pushed Keith away. Keith stood there, stunned. Richard, Mom won't forgive you. You won't leave Mom, right? You'll come back, won't you? Richard, shaking off Yasmin's clinging hands, looked her straight in the eye and said, I won't return to this house. And slowly let go of her hands. But Yasmin stubbornly grabbed Richard's arm. Richard, you're being deceived by this woman. Dad, stop Richard. That's right. He's the precious heir. Does an heir abandon his parents? As the in-laws shrieked, shaking Richard's shoulders, Rebecca, his fiancée, stepped forward and said, Excuse me, and then asked, You keep mentioning an heir, but do you have something to inherit? Her tone was devoid of any malice, merely posing a simple question. Her elegant demeanor left me and my parents speechless, while Renee was holding back laughter behind them. The room fell silent at Rebecca's words. Then Richard said, That's enough. Richard said this, placing his hand on the in-law's shoulders, then moved closer to Keith, who was sitting in a daze, and met his gaze. You see now, don't you? It's sad, but this is who our parents really are. You've had it rough since you were a kid, probably more so than me. Richard reached out to Keith's shoulder, but Keith shrugged it off. Don't joke with me. I've done nothing wrong. I am the representative of this family, he yelled weakly. Richard sighed at Keith's words and said firmly, Okay, I get it. But take full responsibility of what you've done. What you did to Yolanda is serious. What do you mean, take responsibility? Grabbing Keith's shoulders, Richard said in a gentle yet firm voice. After this, live your own life. And left the house, his arm around Rebecca's shoulder. As silence returned, my parents and I stood up and said, We will now discuss things through lawyers. And to Keith's mistress, who was so proudly rubbing her belly. I bowed sarcastically. Thank you for freeing Keith from threats and violence and his habit of giving all his earnings to his parents. What do you mean? She asked, following us. But we ignored her and left the in-laws' house. After that, the divorce was finalized through lawyers. Recordings of verbal abuse and medical reports worked in my favor. And despite the short marriage, I received a substantial compensation in the divorce. As for Keith's mistress, as suspected, the baby wasn't Keith's. The timing of the affair and the pregnancy didn't add up. But Keith, in his elation, didn't even notice. Of course, Keith and the in-laws were furious, and they divorced right after the child was born. They're still arguing over the divorce settlement and child support. On top of that, Keith had amassed a large debt from the money he gave his parents and the compensation to me. The in-laws, far from helping, berated him daily as the stupid son who lost his wife and is burdened with debt, and kept him in a small dark room, saving the largest room for when the eldest son returned. Renee came to Richard's and my in-laws' house because on the day we reunited, the conversation led to Richard being engaged to Rebecca, a friend from his college. Seeing me in tatters, she wondered if her friend may face the same fate immediately contacted Rebecca. But her worries were unfounded, as she was reassured by Richard's strong will. I was surprised by Rebecca's calm demeanor. Rebecca was born into a family with a long lineage and was the only daughter of a chairman who ran several companies. She found it strange that a regular salaried family worried about an heir. Kind of naive, but a really nice person, right? Renee laughed. Since then, Renee and I often meet for coffee and meals. I shuddered to think, what would have happened to me if Renee hadn't been there that day? I really owe you one. Thanks to you, Renee. As I bowed my head, Renee said, "What are you saying?" But in a way, the biggest contributor was Rebecca, and laughed. I also laughed, remembering Rebecca's graceful manner at the time. I wish Richard and his wife happiness, but I can't say I hate Keith from the bottom of my heart. I feel sorry for Keith, who was blinded by the false love of his parents and taken advantage of and manipulated by them. Keith is a victim too. Thinking about that makes my heart ache. But as an adult, he should be able to distinguish between right and wrong. He should have the courage to accept his own need for love. It's no excuse for harassing the partner he chose for life. I, too, will work towards independence from now on. I quietly hope that one day Keith will find his way back to being an adult.